Let me welcome everybody to Book Talks. This is a series of conversations with authors about their books, hosted collaboratively by Pittsburgh Theological Seminary's Center for Writing and Learning Support and the Barber Library. My name is Shan Overton, and I'm the director of the Center for Writing and Learning Support here at the seminary. And along with my Barber Library colleagues, Director Michelle Spummer, who is standing in the back, hello Michelle, and User Services Librarian Tisha Wu, who's right over here to my right, I'd like to say how glad we are that you all are here in person and online via Zoom. We are here to celebrate a new book by our special guest and colleague, the Reverend Dr. Roger Owens, about whom I'll talk a little more in just a moment. I want to just note for the record that this is the first live one we've had officially during the school year since before COVID. And so we had one this summer that was kind of tied in with one of the D-Min cohorts being here, but this is really a great gift to be here with everybody back in the library. And it's so nice to see all of you here and to know that there are a bunch of y'all online as well. We'd also like to make a special welcome to participants from the AIM graduate reunion who are here, led by my colleague, the Reverend Karen Rohr. Welcome to folks from the Center for Adaptive and Innovative Ministry, Please be aware we are recording this event, and it will be put on the PTS website, the Book Talks page, as well as on our YouTube channel. So if you want to ask crazy questions, but you don't want it recorded, maybe wait till after we turn the computers off. Or you can email Dr. Owens with your crazy questions. Additionally, we have a photographer here taking photographs of the event. If you do not, and you're here in person and do not want your photograph taken, please just raise your hand and the photographer will avoid your image. Those could be on the PTS website. Today, we're, as I said before, we're going to be in conversation with PTS faculty member Roger Owens about his new book, Everyday Contemplative, The Way of Prayerful Living, which was published recently by Upper Room Books, located in my hometown of Nashville, Tennessee. And in a moment, I'll say a little more about Roger, but we have a few announcements to make, as we always do, as well as thank yous. First of all, those of you who are on Zoom can check in your chat window for links for the PTS Book Talk page and for Amazon and bookshop.org, where you can purchase Roger's book. We always provide that so that as a resource to people so that they can go and get the book if they do not already have a copy. Those of you who are here in person, if you don't already have the book and would like to purchase one, Michelle, my colleague, does have books in the back. They're $10 a piece, cash only. So we're happy, and Roger, we thank you for bringing those. And those who are here, if you'd like to have your book signed, you can do so at the end of the event this evening. For just a moment, I'd like to turn over the microphone to my colleague Tisha Wu, who is going to talk about our LibGuide and the display in the library.
Thank you and welcome from the library. So library staff have curated a set of resources associated with Roger's topic. Of course, it includes his book as well as associated resources on this general topic of contemplative practice. Hopefully by the end of this, I'll get that right. So that will be available. We'll put it in the chat for our online participants because you can access that through our website. And for those of you who are here and registered today, we will send that out in an email, which leads me to my next thing, which is that if you did not register today, I will pass around a sign-up sheet just so we can have a record of your being here and we can send you those helpful links and resources. If you are coming back to the library, we do have a display as well, which includes many of the resources in the LibGuide, the print resources listed in the LibGuide, and I'll be passing around our display bibliography so you can get a sneak peek of some of the things that are up there. So please do come back during our open hours and check out those materials as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Tisha, and thanks again to you and to Michelle for your hospitality. for hosting book talks here. I also want to say thank you to Holly McKelvey, who is the assistant for the Writing Center, who did the registration and a lot of behind-the-scenes work for this, and also our communications department, Melissa Logan and Robin Menard, who helped us get the word out for this. And a very special thank you always to our indefatigable IT department, especially Bobby Jarsulik, who's in the back and will be helping us manage today from behind the scenes. We really couldn't do this without all of this help and support from the PTS community. So our format today, I'm going to introduce Roger some more and ask a few opening questions. But in the meantime, I'd like to invite you all to think about questions that you might have for him about contemplative practice in everyday life. This includes those of you who are online with us. We welcome your questions in the chat. Bobby will be watching the chat, and when the questions come up, he will flag me, and he will read those out loud for Roger so Roger can speak to them eloquently. We really do want audience participation, so I will start off the Q&A just to warm everybody up, but I really hope that you'll join in the conversation. We encourage your participation because it is important in the book talk model. Also, one more quick note for those who are on Zoom. You'll see a live transcription button at the bottom of your screen if you'd like to read along with us instead of just listening. And now to formally welcome our guest, Dr. Roger Owens. He is professor of Christian spirituality and ministry here at PTS, and is the new co-senior pastor, that's a mouthful, with his wife, the Reverend Ginger Thomas of Fox Chapel Presbyterian Church. He received his MDiv and his PhD in theology from Duke University, where he received a Lilly Fellowship for the formation of a learned clergy, which is good. Learned is good. Okay. So while in North Carolina, Lily is good too, yes. While in North Carolina, he served both urban and rural churches in the United Methodist Church for 8 years as a co-pastor with Ginger Thomas before coming to PTS. While at PTS, he's taught classes such as Wisdom from the Desert, The Spirituality of Thomas Merton, Introduction to the Pastoral Arts, Pastor as Adaptive Change Leader, Spiritual Formation, Theology of Church Ministry and Pastoral Spirituality, and next June, a course on spirituality and creative writing in the Doctor of Ministry in Creative Writing and Public Theology, for which I'm the faculty mentor, and I'm really grateful that you're going to do that, Roger. It's going to be a great final class for them. Roger's books, in addition to the one that we're talking about today, include, and this is just a small selection, A New Day in the City, Urban Church Revival, What We Need Is Here, Practicing the Heart of Christian Spirituality, and The Shape of Participation, a theology of church practices, which the Christian Century called this decade's best work in ecclesiology. Big words. I mean, that's pretty cool.
That was a long time ago.
But that's cool.
The decade's over.
That was really, I was like, that's pretty cool. I didn't even know that.
It should be that decade's.
That decade's right. What, the early 2000s?
I think they thought the decade had just begun, so it was the first book in ecclesiology yet published in that decade.
Oh. Well, it's great you got the label before anybody else. Roger preaches and lectures across the U.S., and his work has appeared in such publications as The Christian Century, Currents in Theology and Mission, the Journal of Religious Ethics, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's a wonderful list. He and Ginger are the parents of 3 children, Simeon, Silas, and Mary Claire, and I wanted to say this because they make appearances in your book.
All of them.
Which is wonderful. And so let me say welcome, Roger, and let the grilling begin. Although this is not really a grilling. So what I wanted to do first is ask you to tell us about the book. Where did the idea for the book come from, and how did the pandemic shape it? Because that's one of the matters that you discuss in the front and back of the book in terms of how it came into being.
Yeah. Well, first, Shan, thanks for the invitation to do this and to be with you this evening. And after all that reading of things I've done or written, you finally got to the important part, which was Ginger and Simeon and Silas and Mary Claire, who are wonderful jewels in my life. So lots of fun. one of which is recently off to college and deeply missed. So, you warned me that you were going to ask about where the idea for the book came from. And so I went through and looked at some of my old journals because I thought, I wonder where the idea for that book came from. And in 2019, I had a contract to write a book with Fortress Press on pastoral leadership and congregational spirituality. I had sent them an idea for a book, and then the editor there kind of liked the idea but thought we should shift it a little bit, so she and I went back and forth, and we finally came up with something mutually agreeable to us. And this is what you're supposed to want, right? A contract for a book, because when you need to get tenure or promotion or something, you want a contract, right? And I spent lots of time thinking about that book. And then I got very busy being the acting dean here for a little while and didn't think about it at all. And then I realized I didn't want to write that book. I mean, for every one idea I have that comes to fruition, I have to have 10 or 20 or 30 other ideas. And sometimes you get excited about an idea and you think someone else gets excited about it, so you get all the way to working it out and making a promise before you pause and you ask, do I really want to spend 18 months, 24 months of my life working on that book? And I didn't want to do that. And then we got to January of 2020. It was my last month of being acting dean here. And so I was starting to go to Panera over in Waterworks every morning at about 7 o'clock, doing some writing, making some space for creativity and ideas to flow again, because they hadn't for about 5 or 6 months. And one of the things I was writing on was this book, and that's when I realized I didn't want to do it. And so I had this journal that has about 5 pages of notes and outlines for an introduction to the book I didn't want to write. And you can see that they're all marked out. Like all those outlines are marked out. And then I get to this, and I have this other journal where I kind of take notes on things. And I just thought it was interesting to me when I looked at it today. So let's see if we can find February 2nd, 2020.
Groundhog Day.
Is that Groundhog Day? Yes. So I was worried about the weather. So I wrote in my journal at Panera Bread on a very early in the morning, I think I'm starting another book. And I'm not going to tell anyone about it. I'm not going to get a contract for it or post on Facebook about it until I have the introduction and 2 chapters finished and the others brainstormed and outlined. So I made a little rule for myself. This one's going to be a secret hidden book because I made a mistake of getting too excited about a book I didn't want to write. And then the rest of the page in that journal is starting to write about sitting in a green lazy boy early in the morning. And but the idea for the book did not start there. So for a number of years, I've given lectures with an organization called the Academy for Spiritual Formation. And when I give a series of lectures on reading scripture for spiritual formation, as opposed to all the other wonderful but sometimes malforming ways we read scripture, I always start with a lecture on, well, if we're going to read scripture for spiritual formation, what might characterize our approach? Like, what might be the aspects of our approach? And I had this list of 7 characteristics of an approach, and just 3 or 4 sentences on each one, because it was only the last 15 minutes of the lecture. And I'm sure that I came up with those and thought that this was a good idea, because many years earlier, I went to the Duke Integrative Medicine, so this was back when I lived in North Carolina, and took their 8-week mindfulness-based stress reduction course. And when you begin that course, if you read John Kabat-Zinn on mindfulness, he always begins with these are things you might want to keep in mind, kind of aspects of an approach to this. So like non-doing and just being and not trying to accomplish something. And I was so taken by that you would begin a practice thinking about how you would approach the practice. And I had written a book, you mentioned it, What We Need Is Here, Practicing the Heart of Christian Spirituality, which was a book of 7 spiritual practices, core practices through which, I said in the book, Jesus offers himself to us. So I thought, well, that book kind of needs a prequel that says, but how would you, if you're going to do those things, what might be an inner approach? Like, how would you want to approach that? And not just those practices, not when you're just sitting with your butt in the chair or you're on the cushion or you're in worship or you're serving the poor, not just when you're doing the practices, but throughout your life, when you're also washing the dishes and having a marital spat and making lunch with your 12-year-old daughter, was like I was this morning when I didn't want to make lunch with my 12-year-old daughter because my coffee was hot, right? Like how do you approach, if you want to live contemplatively, right? And it seemed to me like it was worth exploring that because of certain connotations we have with the word contemplative. Last Friday, I was at the Abbey of Gethsemane in Kentucky, which was Thomas Merton's abbey. And some of us think that you have to be a monk in a monastery to live a contemplative life. And they have all of the supports they need to live a contemplative life. And those of us who don't live in an abbey have almost none of the supports we need to live a contemplative life. And yet, historically, it's been affirmed again and again and again that a life in the rough and tumble of the world and of friends and church and family and work can be a life that's open, available, and responsive to God. So I just wanted to explore that on the page and see if anything could come of it.
And it did.
And it did.
And it did.
It did, yeah.
So, okay, this is not, I didn't have this in my plan to ask, really, but it kind of is a follow-up, which is, it seems like what you're talking about is very countercultural to the way that we live, and that to do the writing practice that you did is also against the grain. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's not to an end like the academy drives things, right? Where you have the book contract or you have tenure and sight, and you're like driving toward that. It seems like the practice of this book itself came out of the same type of practice that you're advocating in the book,
right?
So that the openness, like you're talking about, an open in response to God, right? So the book is also that, and I'd be interested in a little bit more about that.
I hope the book is. It certainly comes out of a mining my sense of vocation and call to use words to help introduce or awaken or open people in everyday life to a deeper life with God. I mean, that's a real central part of my vocation. I'm lucky to be at a seminary that values that and says, sure, write a book for people who aren't other academics because this matters. But it also, I mean, I think in contrast to the book I didn't write, I mean, that was a striving book. There was a grasping there. There was okay, I'm done with something. I have to have something. I get nervous when I don't know what's next. And so I too quickly, without listening to the voice of vocation and the Spirit of God wrestling in my own spirit to say, yes, this is the one that's right. And I should have known better, because I know that the things that are right come out of, for me, of just writing and making lists and outlining until something bubbles up. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So I think it is. And then in the writing of it, I mean, I did write it during the pandemic, but the idea didn't come during the pandemic. So the pandemic just gave me the time and the space, a lot of time on the back patio. I mean, I know that for many people that was frantic, dreadful, trying to figure out where the next paycheck is going to come from. And I felt very privileged for that to be a contemplative year and a half for me, teaching from home, lots of time. Yeah, mostly just sitting in the front yard. Yeah.
And sharing the basement with one of your kids.
Yeah, sharing the basement with the kids. But I wrote a lot of poems about squirrels during the pandemic, because it was just me and the squirrels in the front yard. This morning I wrote haiku about the chipmunks, because I was on the back patio and they kept running back and forth with their little cheeks full, and then they'd go back 2 minutes later and their cheeks would be empty and the cheeks would be full. And I was like, wow, this is really great. But
squirrels in the front yard, chipmunks in the back.
Yeah, exactly.
They're all raising hell, right?
Exactly.
Well, okay, so you mentioned the Lazy Boy. So I wanted to ask you, as you know, about the cover and the fact that the book sort of starts and ends with your space, with the context in which you were doing writing, and the publisher decides on this image. So talk to us a little bit about the kind of sausage making machine behind the cover.
We chatted about that a little.
Yes,
in your
we
office.
did. And I'm always interested in this because I think for writers, this is important information to think about, is how we negotiate these things.
Yeah. So the first few pages are about a green lazy boy. The green lazy boy shows up in all of my books on Christian spirituality. It's a character. Like my children and wife, the green lazy boy is a character. But it's a little more prominent in this one because I talk about in the very first pages how that's the chair where I pray in, where I do the things that look spiritual, or I fail at doing things that look spiritual. But I also say in the first page, but that's also over the years where I've done a lot of things that you wouldn't think of as the spiritual life. I've wrestled with my kids. I've had marital arguments in that chair. I've eaten meals in that chair. I watched TV and football in that chair, and other things. And I began thinking, this isn't just like the place. It's also for me a symbol of living, not just of 20 minutes of a spiritual practice, meditation or silence. And then it ends with me like launching me out of the chair, right, into life. Because that's what the book's about, the way of prayerful living. And so when the publisher sent a picture of a green lazy boy for the front cover, my heart just sank. Because I'm like, the contemplative life is not just about sitting around. And I said, that's it. I mean, the whole point of the lazy boy was to get launched into life, not just to stay in the lazy boy. And so there was no back and forth. We had lots of back and forth about the subtitle, and you only have so much money in the bank when it comes to these kinds of negotiations. I've worked with this publisher before, but many personnel had changed the last time. They just sent me cover after cover until I liked it, and this time the marketing team says, no, this is it. But since then, I'll tell you, I've really come to love the cover, partly because the green lazy boy has been such a significant part of my life, and my dad had a green lazy boy, and so in my other books I've written about my dad's green lazy boy and how I played the same games with my kids called You'll Never Get Loose. Is exactly what it sounds like, and it was the game my dad played with me when he sat in his green lazy boy watching golf on Sunday afternoons or the Cubs lose on Saturday afternoons, and so but more importantly, like many people have mentioned it to me, they'll think about, they're like, I have an old lazy boy, and my dad had an old lazy boy, and so what I've discovered is that the lazy boy, I think, doesn't say life with God is about sitting around. Contemplative life, I think it's a picture of every day. It's the everyday part. There's nothing more everyday. There's nothing less esoteric, right, than an old lazy boy that's been sad in an awful lot. And so I think that works. I think it works.
Yeah. Yeah, when I first saw it, I took it as the everyday.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, for sure. I wondered, since you've mentioned it, and this is on my list, but it's not the next question, which is who's reading the book and how are they responding to it besides the cover? I mean, what are you hearing from people as you get around and talk about it? This has been one of the fun things about publishing a book post-Zoom, because you can hang out with a lot of groups that are reading your book that you didn't get to hang out with. You used to have to travel someplace to hang out with people and they couldn't afford your airfare and you didn't get to do it. And now people call, my friend who's a chaplain at the University of Richmond teaches a course in the spring on pilgrimage. And then they take a pilgrimage with the undergraduates at the University of Richmond. He said, I'm having them read your book because I think this approach you talk about is exactly the approach they need. Can you zoom in and meet with, my students? And I'll tell you what, I was terrified. Like 18 to 22-year-olds, they just scared me to death. I thought I would have nothing in common. What could I possibly say that would matter to these young people? It seems so far away from where I am and where I've been. And I'll tell you what, I couldn't believe that the approach I talk about in this book really mattered to them. They feel so the crunch to do everything and be everything now, that the invitation from this book really spoke to them.
I also read, this was the other, it was really cool to me. So Maxwell Muska, a PTS grad, is an associate pastor at the Presbyterian Church in my hometown where I grew up. So he got in touch with me and he said, our group is going to read this. Will you zoom in? And he said, an old high school classmate of yours is in the group. And I thought, oh no, I don't know about that. And other people you might know because it was my hometown. And my 4th grade teacher was in that group. Mr. Kramer, who scared me more than 18-year-olds scare me now. And he was my first and last basketball coach. And I just remember him as this guy who made us run line laps when we didn't do things right. And he read the whole book. And of course, he's probably in his 80s now and was so appreciative, and he even opened to a page near the end and he said, here's the section I read and I wrote in the bottom of my book, this is so true and so hard. And I just thought, I don't even never need to write again. Like, this is it,
Well, that actually, I've heard that from other authors who say, the one person who really needed this book got it.
Yeah.
And that was enough, whether it sells any more copies or not.
And then there was a really early morning with a Baptist men's group in Texas, all retired Baptist men. And I thought, I'm either doing something right or wrong. If I can write a book that undergraduates of the University of Richmond and retired Baptist men in Texas are both connecting with. So, yeah.
That's great. And to me, it's a practical book because it has suggestions for, thought experiments as well as for writing, which I'm a big fan of. How do you envision both individuals and groups using it? Like, when you wrote it, what were you hoping for, and is that bearing out?
I think it might be. It's hard to say. Someone in a clergy group who is using it emailed me to say we really love the reflections at the end, the invitations for spiritual exercise. My own spiritual director was leading a retreat in Wheeling, and with some other sisters. And one of the sisters who she was doing spiritual direction with told her she was reading this book called Everyday Contemplative. And she really liked, at the end of each chapter, I invite you to write a letter to God about, whatever the chapter was about, being honest about how this is for you, what it feels like, where the struggles are. And then write a letter imagining what God might write back to you about this very thing. And she told my spiritual director, not knowing that we had any connection, that exercise was really meaningful to her. And of course, their spirituality is Ignatian, and so the move to a kind of conversation where you're imagining what God or Jesus or Mary or whoever's in the scene is saying to you is very natural. I imagine for some folks that would feel really risky. Can I really imagine what God might say to me? So. I think it's been useful. I'm writing a leader's guide for using this book in Lent. That will be a PDF free on the Upper Room site, probably in December or January. So groups in Lent that want to use it as a Lenten book will have guidance for how to use it as a group.
That was one of the things I was thinking a lot about, is that it would be really easy to take it and utilize it in parish life or congregational life, or with, chaplaincy groups or things like that. It seems that it's very accessible, and even if the group itself didn't read the whole book, that the exercises in it and the scriptures that both you talk about, but you also give a list of scripture at the end that people could utilize to reflect on a particular theme. It seemed to me, as an educator, I was like, I can totally see how we could take this and, just use it. And hopefully people will read it, but also that it would be able to guide not only individuals, but a group.
Yeah, I would hope so.
Yeah, which is a gift, because not everything offers that, let's just say. Before I ask any more questions, I want to ask if there's anyone here who has something they'd like to come up and ask, and if so, we have a microphone right here. Bobby, also, I wanted to check in with you and see if there's not anybody on the chat yet. We do want your questions. Would love for you to be in conversation with Roger as well as me, because I'm not the only one that has good questions in here, I'm sure. Anyone at this time that wants to come up and ask a question? Not yet? Okay, get brave, people. Get brave. Because, I mean, I got plenty, but I just want to welcome everybody to join in the conversation. So let's get into the content a little bit. One of the concepts or sort of overarching ideas in this has to do with the importance of creating a certain posture in a person's life to develop a contemplative life. So everything is sort of framed under that. So talk to us about what you mean by a posture, how that connects with living, right, the act of living, and how does that encourage healthy prayer for us?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I said a little bit about it just about that experience with that in that mindfulness class, about how being reminded of an approach to this. You will remember Yanni, our colleague Yanni Schwartz. He often talked about a posture, the church's posture towards a world. And I think Dr. Hagley uses that language. I think I kind of picked up the language of posture because it was in the water around here. But it really spoke to me because our posture. Just think about your own posture right now, or your posture when you're praying, or your posture in church, or when your posture says something. You just heard me lecture on this a couple Saturday mornings ago. Your posture says something about when you see someone in a posture, about your approach, right? And your readiness for a certain kind of activity, your physical posture. Mm-hmm. And so I kind of took that as a metaphor to say, well, what would it mean to have I guess the other word would be like attitude, right? But there was something shallow about attitude to me that, fleeting or an ephemeral about attitude, but an inner posture that characterizes your approach. Like, what are characteristics of your way of approaching a life with God? And so the book toggles back and forth between sometimes talking about prayer, like when you're sitting, got your butt in the chair, you're reading scripture, you're walking the labyrinth, like you're doing the prayer practice, and daily life. When you're I think there's probably a little illustration about like being in a meeting. Not that I've ever been in the kind of meeting that I talk about in the book, especially here. But just in case you're in a meeting and you get impatient, the patience chapter might be relevant to that. So I think so the posture, and I found that connects with people. That image of that metaphor of an inner posture.
Well, and it did make a lot of sense to me, because part of what it seems that you're saying is, here's how you sort of create clear ground, for you to have a relationship with God. And, you sort of open a space that wasn't there before because you crowded in with so much other stuff from life, being busy, thinking about, accumulating things, getting awards, external things. And so this felt to me that it was sort of an opening of a space inside of ourselves, and getting in touch with an interior life that I find most Americans do not have. And so, looking for approaches, methods, ways of being aware of inner movement is something that I think is really needed, which is connected with me in terms of what that idea of posture meant.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. That makes sense, yeah. Especially one of the chapters is on attentiveness.
Yes.
And since we're drinking wine, I use that illustration of a sommelier tasting wine. I mean, can we approach our lives the kind of way someone tastes wine, really savoring, each sip and getting the fullest flavor out of that.
Yeah, that really spoke to me in a way, because often, you'll hear sommeliers and you go, oh yeah, give me a break. Like, you can really tell this is Hungarian soil from near a particular river in this mountain range. But yet people who pay that kind of attention, they actually can roll those things across their palate and know that.
Right.
And that was like, whoa, to think about that, and that it's not just about posturing in a fancy pants kind of way,
so in the spiritual formation class, we've been talking about reading scripture that way. And we contrast that with the way we might read scripture in another class when you're writing an exegesis paper, or when your church encourages everyone to read the whole Bible every year, right? That's a different way of reading. And they all have their place. But I kind of asked, what would it be like to savor a word or line of Scripture the way, a sommelier savors that sip of wine and just get everything out of it. And then if you're approaching life that way, well, you'd never get through your morning cup of coffee, would you? You'd never get out of the house. But that's not so bad.
Yeah, it reminded me of this. Years ago, I was leading an interreligious dialogue retreat, and we had a Buddhist chef come to talk to the college students about how to cook and eat attentively. Mm-hmm. And he made them take M&Ms and put them in their mouths and not eat them immediately, but to actually let the taste go across their tongue and notice the different tastes that were in it as it dissolved. And it was like, for these 18 and 20-year-olds, they were like, oh, I had no idea. There's bitterness. There's, it's not all sweet. It's not, but it was so interesting. And that was what I heard out of that chapter, or read in that chapter a lot, was that even paying attention to the morning coffee or the sip of wine or the water you're drinking, anything you're doing, if you take a moment and acknowledge that, it's like all of life becomes grace, which is a great point. Yeah. Right. It's really rich. Okay, but let's not get on to that because I'll go way too far on that one. But I wanted to ask you, one of the things that I find interesting about your thinking is that you lean on Quaker thinkers a lot.
One in particular,
but you have a couple in there.
Douglas steers the other.
Yeah. Right. And so the Quaker spirituality is threaded in this book. I know that you've written some other stuff involving Quakers as touchstones for the kind of spiritual life that you are suggesting. And so I wanted to ask you about the Quakers and the ways you resonate with them and why. Mm-hmm. Why them? How did you come across them? Yeah. What's happening with that?
How many of you read Thomas Kelly's little book, A Testament of Devotion? Oh my goodness. So if you have $10 extra, don't buy my book. Go out and order Thomas Kelly's A Testament of Devotion. So it really is. Thomas Kelly is my Quaker friend, and that, no pun intended. And so I only actually worshipped at a Quaker meeting house for the first time this summer. Though I have been to Pendle Hill, which is a Quaker retreat center, so I've worshipped with them in the mornings in the silence. So Thomas Kelly was an early 20th century Quaker, born in the late 1880s. And he just lived a fascinating life of grasping, searching for achievement. And at a point in my life, it really reminded me of my own life. So my own spiritual director suggested I read Kelly. Normally he didn't suggest I read books because he knew I was always in my head and thought that was not a good thing for me. But he suggested this book, and I found a copy, and it was at that moment it was a kind of a life-changing read, because it gave me permission to begin to let go of all begin to let go of the striving and the ambition and the hurry and the thinking I have to be all things right now. And Kelly had done that. Kelly got his master's, was a Bachelor of Divinity at the time, from Harvard Theological Seminary, and a PhD from Harvard Theological Seminary, and then went to Earlham College to teach in Richmond, Indiana, and then ended up at Haverford College, a kind of elite, I think, men's school at the time in Philadelphia. But he never kind of thought he was good enough, and so he enrolled to get another PhD at Harvard. Because Hartford Theological Seminary, who knows what Harvard, who's ever heard of them, but Harvard, and he studied with Alfred North Whitehead at Harvard, working on his PhD, and he has some really interesting, in his letters, he has some interesting quips about Whitehead and about Bertrand Russell, when Bertrand Russell came and lectured at Harvard, and spending some time with him. But he wrote and he finished his dissertation, but because of health reasons, he wasn't able to get to Harvard to defend it. He even published it with Princeton University Press, and it was about a French phenomenologist or mathematician or something. So in around October 1937, he finally showed up at Harvard to defend his second PhD dissertation, and he had a panic attack, a breakdown, something happened while in the middle of his defense, and he went blank. And they wouldn't let him do it again. This Harvard PhD, which was the thing that was finally going to make him an adequate human being in the world, that's what he needed, was just ripped out of his grasp. And he fell into deep depression. His wife feared he was suicidal. Friends from Haverford, Douglas Steere, the other Quaker who I write a little bit about, or at least quote in the book, came to visit him. And this was just a phenomenal turning point. And it was the place in his life where he came out of that depression and then began not caring about academic publishing anymore. And he wrote for Quaker newsletters, and he gave talks with church groups, and he did the kind of thing that made sense to him, and his life was more free, and he was more spontaneous, playful. He started having anyway his life, and for him that would be where he moved to what I call spirituality in the passive voice, which is the name of the first chapter. That moved from I'm the one who's going to make something happen here if my life is going to amount to anything, to this beautiful, terrifying God is at work very deeply in me. And sometimes when God's inviting me to let go of things, he says positions of prominence, eminences, it hurts really bad, but there's a new freedom on the other side. And so just at a time, that book just over the years has meant a great deal to me. I think probably vocationally I've tried to do, I think he's inspired me in many ways to write in a similar vein and maybe relax a little bit about some things.
Yeah, it seems, you and I talked about this a little bit a couple of days ago, but just about that you didn't have a lot of interest in continuing to do academic writing, to go down that road, that you were more interested in writing books like this than in that, and that seems a kindred spirit for sure.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Is that because it allows more creativity for you, flexibility, allows more flow? There's an openness to it when it's this versus what you think academia wants?
Well, sometimes, so the question for me is always, am I just lazy, right? Because a church, I did a retreat with a men's group, and they read my book on midlife spirituality, which is really a memoir. And one guy came up to me and he said, I think it's really important to be honest. And I thought to myself, actually it's not. But, when anyone says that to you, I think, maybe it's not that important. He's like, but there's an awful lot of I in here. And I thought to myself, well, that is kind of the danger of memoir. There's going to be the I. But could there be a laziness? There's a lot of I in here too, though I always hope the personal stories open up into something richer and deeper and broader than just the personal story, which might just be an entrance. But I have to ask myself, it's easy to write that way. It's easier to write that way for me because I'm not researching. I'm not doing what so many of my colleagues do, which is spend a lot of time in a room with all their books stacked along and chasing down this reference. And, most of the quotes and the references in here, either people I'd read so many times or loved that as I was writing, I didn't have to have the book nearby. And then it was only at the end that I had to go track them down. So there's always that question, who knows? if I might in prayer and writing and a book, an invitation might feel like to spend, because I do often feel like I'm in a hurry. And I think maybe writing an academic book that takes 3 or 4 years would actually be a spiritual practice of slowing down.
Be a good speed bump for you.
And paying attention so it's always that. There's always that. It's always that mix for me.
Yeah. That's so interesting to think about all you writers in the room. thinking about that. Okay, before I ask another question, let me just see if anyone, either online or here in person, would like to jump in. I would be so happy for you to. Charles in the back, come on up.
A plant.
No, I didn't gin this one up, I promise. Yeah, please use that mic.
Well, I'm curious with your ecumenical and interreligious influences in your writing on the contemplative practice, such as Seiza and posture in the Japanese tradition, and speaking of the Catholic tradition and Abbey of Gethsemane and Thomas Merton where he taught, how much of your inspiration comes unconfined in a denominational sense? Meaning, can you speak to the purity of what's coming to you in your contemplative life and some of the struggles you might have occasionally with denominational contexts and things of that nature when you're opening up to the outflow of spirit in your life and you're becoming still and you're not moving more towards being instead of doing, and you've got timelines and deadlines you're writing for, you've got requirements put on you, but yet you're hitting this golden thread of universal mystical opportunity in everyday life that's coming from so many different cultural influences. And speak a little bit maybe to the cultural influences and how maybe unframing what you allow yourself to hear infuses your work.
Yeah, wow, that's a big question,
Yeah.
and it
Here's a whole book.
It makes what I do sound more interesting than it really is, because I think it's just I've read things that I think are interesting, like, oh, I read this book and I really like it, you know what I'm reading this week? I'm reading books about the Japanese Zen monk and poet in the late 18th century, Ryokan, and this holy fool, and who's like the Saint Francis of Japan. I mean, just absolutely. That's probably why I'm writing a haiku about chipmunks this week. And so, I mean, unfortunately, the other word for what you just described is a dilettante, right? Someone who, and I feel like maybe there should be I need to have an apologetic for my approach, and I don't have one. I just like to read and experience different folks. And I do have certain traditions in Christian spirituality that have formed me the most in terms of my spiritual approach. Probably John of the Cross, the Carmelite tradition, which is why I love Merton when Merton's talking about John of the Cross. Just last night I was reading a lecture Merton gave to some sisters at a retreat in 1967 or 68, so right before he flew to the East. And it's a chapter on Zen, and he basically says Zen is John of the Cross without the Christian theology, right? Well, that's an interesting thing. For one thing, does a cloistered Christian monk, is he really the person who gets to say those kinds of things? But he has spent a great deal of time with folks, reading them, and writing letters back and forth. Some folks have suggested that the Zen writer and scholar that he was most influenced by was actually not representative of broader traditions in Zen, so he might have a kind of narrow approach. I don't know if that answers it. It's just, but I would not say that I was formed in a deeply, raised as a Methodist. I wouldn't say, I never quote Wesley. Well, love divine, all love's excelling. So Charles Wesley shows up in here. But the neurotic brother never does. So.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, thanks, Charles.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, there is a way in which, along that line, there's an interreligious and ecumenical dimension to the mystical contemplative life. I mean, to me, at some point, a lot of it is about this openness and responsiveness to God or the divine or the way, as the Taoists would say. That there's and the Quakers would say the way also. There's an interesting sense in which there's a similar posture going on across these different traditions, which I personally found interesting,
right,
just over my years of study.
Yeah, I was just thinking about this on a walk today. I thought, if you put, an Abbey of Gethsemane monk meditating and a Zen monk meditating, and you did what the neuroscientists want to do, which is hook their brains up to some meter, their brains would be doing the same thing. But I've been formed enough by Wittgenstein and post-liberal theology that I would say, but that doesn't mean they're doing the same thing, because the way we narrate, the traditions out of which we narrate what we're doing, and our own self-description of an act is essential to what the act actually is, right? And so, anyway, I don't know why I was thinking that, but...
Well, many ways up the same mountain.
Right.
Instead of only one way up the mountain, or many ways up many different mountains.
Yeah,
yeah.
Right. Well, so...
Yeah.
I think I can remember, can I tell you the first chipmunk haiku I wrote this morning? I think it was like this. I sit still, I pray. Chipmunk runs back and forth, so it must have had another syllable in there. I sit still, I pray. The chipmunk runs back and forth. There are many paths, right? And that was, the chipmunk has his path, and I have my path, and
we're all chipmunks on a path.
We might not be climbing the same mountain, me and the chipmunk. I don't know. So.
That's right. Though those chipmunks might beat us there. They're pretty fast little boogers. Bobby, I saw you make a nod, so that means we probably have a question. Go for it.
We do. How does a person balance savoring / being attentive in one's everyday life and still getting all the things done? And more specifically, how to do that as a full-time pastor, particularly when congregants don't think you are doing enough.
Yeah. So, shameless plug for my lecture on October the 25th, the title of which is The Good Enough Pastor. Because I'll talk more about that. You can't get all the things done. Right? You just can't. You can't get all the things done. You can't get the things done that you expect yourself to get done. And you can't get the things done that your congregation expects you to get done, especially in a post-pandemic church that really feels like it needs to be fixed. None of the things are happening anymore, and so you can't get all the things done. And I think hurry is the enemy of the pastoral life. I really do. It could be just because it could be my personality. I hate being in a hurry. And so there will always be that challenge between the to-do list and especially those things on the to-do list that have been given to me by other folks, and who I'm called to be and what the moment I'm in right now requires. And I don't know that there's a way to balance that. Here's something that I think is interesting. So Thomas Kelly, in A Testament of Devotion, he writes about this kind of busyness, and he says that he calls it going into the recreating silences. He says it doesn't have to complicate your program. Like, you can still live an active, full life. He says it only takes 20 or 30 minutes of silent reflection in the mornings, And it was interesting that is with me because as a professor for 9 years, and then 8 years before that, my wife and I always shared one full-time pastoral position. So I've always had more flexibility than a lot of people for contemplative time, prayer, silence, and in the last year, when I was on sabbatical here, so I spent a whole year as the full-time temporary senior pastor of a complicated congregation. I was busier than I've probably ever been in my life. And I was amazed at how the 20 or 30 minutes of silence in the morning was enough. I thought I needed 3 hours every day. I didn't need 3 hours every day. And so I think you can have a full active plate and still be attentive to what's going on and the person in front of you and what God is doing in this congregation and these people and in you. And you can also find time to be intentional about being open and aware of what God is doing. But there's no 7 easy steps to that. I wish there were.
Mm-hmm. I always think about the example of Desmond Tutu, who spent time in contemplation and prayer in the mornings, and then could go out and stand in between people that were getting ready to do violence to each other during the apartheid era. And, he would say in his books, but also in lectures, that the only way he could do that was to take that time in the morning in his quiet room, which he had special for the purpose. And so it actually does a lot for us that we don't think, because it does clear out that space so that we can be attentive in the situations that we find ourselves in and be responsive without having a lot of extra chatter going on. You know, because part of what slows us down is that we are not only doing something, but then we're thinking things about it while we're doing it. And then that does weird stuff to us, and it kind of either gets us off track or it creates like this like psychological wheel. And so the practices you're talking about are actually kind of letting all that go so that you can just be in the moment and be attentive and be aware and participatory without also having a bunch of other layers. You know, the Buddhists call that the double arrow, where you're like experiencing something, but you're also then feeling the pain of all the other things that are going on or not going on. And it's like shooting yourself in with two arrows instead of just one of dealing with what's in front of you. I want to see if there's anyone else who'd like to ask a question before we wrap up. This is so interesting to me. I could just talk all evening. Please come on up.
So my name is Sean Malarkey. I am, full disclaimer, former student of Rogers in the Christian Spirituality D-Min cohort here at PTS. And one of the things as a small church pastor, a small Episcopalian congregation in the suburbs, as we learned all of these wonderful spiritual practices, you want to get back in your congregational setting and try them out with your people. And so last fall, I did a spiritual practices adult ed series. And I expected it to go better than it did. I tried to frame things well, give them plenty of time. We practiced several different practices. And if I could just take a picture of the look on their faces as we tried Lectio Divina for the first time, and there's just like this blank. You know, there was a divide between where they were at in terms of how they were practicing their spirituality at the time with where I was asking them to go. And one of the things, I really appreciate several things about this book. One of them is the term hedonic adaptation. I've always wanted a cool name for what I've been doing most of my life. But the other thing I really appreciated was this gives me something to use to help bridge that gap, you know? So I kind of wish I had had this book a year ago. I'm curious to see how it'll play out, to spend some time setting that stage, what the posture should be, setting the groundwork for why we're doing what we're doing. So it's more of a statement than a question, but I appreciate it.
Yeah, well, thanks, Sean. And I think that's why I think of it as a prequel to my book on spiritual practices. And it's also why the first posture is longing. Because this works when someone recognizes a longing, right? And it kind of shows up. And yeah, thanks, Sean.
Anyone else online or in person want to ask a question? It is 6 on the nose, and I've got a few closing things I got to do to make this official.
Okay.
First is to thank you for the book and for being here. I found it to be really practical and ecumenical and lovely as a book, and it was really a joy to read.
Thanks, Sharon.
So thank you for it. And as I said earlier, I think it enacts the kind of openness that you're advocating for, as this posture of being connected to God and to others and to the world, and that was really helpful. It's in a very simple way invites us into that space. And of course, appreciated especially the journaling options at the end, since I'm a big fan of writing. Also, I want to say, for those who are here, please be sure to see Michelle Spomer and get a book, if you haven't, for $10 cash at the circulation desk. And Roger is here and has a pen ready to sign if you'd like your book signed. Those online, I want to encourage you to check out the Barber Library LibGuide, as well as you all here once you get home. And also booksellers where you can purchase the book for yourself or for others that you'd like to share it with. I want to thank the audience for your attentiveness today and your presence. It really is a joy to get to have these conversations with you here and to hear your questions, but also just to have you be part of this whole thing and to feel it really nicely. It's wonderful. We have refreshments in the back for those of y'all who are here, so please drink and eat it all so that other people don't have to. And we will be back here in person on the PTS campus on Friday, October the 14th at 5 for another book talk with the author, Dr. Ed Simon, about his book, which I've got here down here at my feet so I can show you. It's called Binding the Ghost, Theology, Mystery, and the Transcendence of Literature from Fortress Press. We'll have registration soon, registration info coming out soon for that book. And again, thank you to Roger, thank you to all of you, and I hope everybody has a great weekend. Happy reading and happy writing as well.
Thank you.